Our first speakers will be Anna Shane from Chestnut Hill College in the USA, and who is also presenting today with Jane White from the University of Waikato. Now, Anna and Jane have some flyers here. I'm going to hand them out to you. Okay, please.
Thank you. Kia ora, you may be wondering why two academics, one from Chestnut Hill College in Philadelphia and one from University of Waikato, are doing a presentation together. And without wanting to take up too much time, it probably is useful to explain the genesis of our thinking currently. Anna and I share so many interests, but we didn't discover each other until I'd finished my PhD, which Eugene Mirsov marked, and he's a colleague of Anna's, and he said, "There's this woman in New Zealand who's quoting you, Anna." And so immediately we were put in touch, and I discovered Anna's PhD written several years earlier, and you would swear that we had from different sides of the world, and Anna in Belgrade at the time, and me in New Zealand, 15 years later was it? 15 years later, thinking and developing similar ideas and developing some thinking around bunting. So we've got together, and today is our thinking and process around a paper that we've been working on probably for about 2 years. Be fair? Yeah. So we'll get underway. I guess our shared thinking begins and ends in some respects in the domain of early childhood education, but we're not suggesting for a moment that play is only located in that domain. Of course, everybody plays. But for the purposes of our paper, we're wanting to make trouble, we guess, for some of the dominant treatments of play in education in our worlds, and I suggest many others at this moment in our history, theoretically, philosophically, ideologically. So we're going to do it, we just want to introduce some of those, the shifts that we're hoping to make using some of the ideas that we're going to present today. So.
All right, so the way how we organize this slide, I will be talking about the predominant today views on play that stem from mostly from the social cultural point of view of Vygotsky and people who follow him. Also from some previous thoughts that were not Vygotsky, but were also in the domain of knowledge and epistemology, like Bateson, for instance. So what we know is that in that kind of a view, play is very valuable for learning from different points of view. For instance, learning to prepare for the future roles in life, or social learning, how to communicate well with other children, or learning of symbolic meanings or something like that.
With Bunting's help and his many other protagonists, we want to reascribe play as a way of being, and when we say being, we mean the event of being, and the notion we want to invoke is this idea of becoming. So seen from this angle, play, we want to suspend this idea that play always has to be somehow tagged to learning, that there has to be some sort of end point to the whole endeavour, and that it's actually using these concepts a way of relating to each other and of being related by other. So it's that notion of addressivity that we've heard a lot about today.
Okay, so to continue with the previous or the contemporary points of view, one of the very dominant concepts about play that comes from Vygotsky is that play develops zones of proximal development, that children in play and adults in play can open up the spaces where they are not yet developed, but they just are developing. That comes from Vygotsky's paper on the role of play in child development, and has been played in many different ways. For instance, in the work of Lois Holtzman and her Institute of Child Development, and some other people connected with the play worlds and the study of play, like that part of social cultural approach, which is already a move away from simply looking as play as kind of some preparation, but already moves into the area of being somehow opened up to something. But yet we think it's talking still not yet completely without preset goals in mind.
Taking a Bakhtinian view allows us to look at play quite differently, we feel, moving away from the idea of this expert-novice relationship where one has to be taken by the other to some sort of dialectical journey leading towards a product. For us, play is an intimate and a precarious way of relating, or not relating, and that's a really key point, that play is generally speaking, for the players, not for those who tend to use it for their own essentialist orientation.
The third one, very known way of thinking of play is development of symbolic processes starts from Piaget probably, and his view of looking at connectedness with play and symbolism. Also then a whole lot of studies coming from Piaget and then reinforced by Vygotsky's analysis of dominance of meaning and object and meaning, or action and meaning and action, all leading toward trying to decode what happens in development of symbolic processes that we want to challenge that.
Of course, we're also interested in the semiotic, David, just to pick up your point from an earlier presentation. But what we're talking about here is a promotion of dialogic inter-adressivity in which the meanings are negotiated as in the social event. So they're not it's not a precursor or a follow-up, it actually takes place in the actual event. Therefore, it's not something that is replicable in the way that we might think of before play as a performance with a script. So we're moving away from that.
Also, one of the very strong positions when people analyze play in terms of social happenings and processes is always an accent on learning how to communicate better, how to be with children in a better way, how to negotiate better, always with a view of agreement and arriving to a shared agreement, a shared world, and we want to negotiate that too, challenge that.
And here it's lovely following on from Corinne. We want to invoke the kind of what she describes intersubjectivity and alterity as two sides of the same coin. So we want to celebrate in the play the alteric potential for any one of us to alter meaning, to confuse people, to refuse, to distort, to ridicule. And in this way we see play as risky, scary, provocative, dangerous, not always pleasurable, not always fun, and not always for learning.
Okay, so we have these two quotes that could symbolize these two positions. Brian Sutton Smith, who is really from New Zealand originally, said the relationship between play and development has come to be so taken for granted that it is invoked almost any time an investigator finds an analogy between a play process and some other developmental processes, almost as if play is the mover of human development.
Whereas in our paper we conclude we want to look through the eyes of the players, and here we attempt to reclaim children's play as an elusive yet highly significant personal and social encounter that is intrinsically valuable to the players as an important and immediate lived experience in their mutual relationships. So that kind of sets the scene, and Anna will talk about the dialogic consideration of play methodologically.
Okay, so again, keeping this opposition in mind, what we want to talk about is how we want to look at play is to look at it as its fullness of a particular moment. Bakhtin talks about event. So we look at play move, and every player's move as what it means in that moment for that particular constellation of players. And in that sense, play is unrepeatable. We also talk in Bakhtinian sense about play utterance or move as an addressive post-book. We'll explain that a little bit later. So an act deed that addresses other people in many complex ways. As players, as characters or personas, as one player presents pronouncement to the others, or in some other unusual, surprising twists. So to look at play like that in terms of utterance also means that it cannot be lifted out of its living context. Each interpretation of an utterance, including the interpretation of an outside observer, as we are, represents only one of the possible different dialogic replies. So our methodology really, Jane has started to do things in a different way than I have been doing things. It's different in 15 years, or maybe even more, and also difference in means and positions of us as different observers. My material comes mostly from my deep involvement in engagements with children in my family. So I was outsider, but also insider and player, and a person who knows a lot about these children or assumes to know a lot, with probably more confidence to interpret what's going on and the meaning as not only an outside observer, but also as an inside observer. While Jane created a new dialogic way of looking at multiple perspectives, both visually by including movies done from the baby's head, from the teacher's head, from the outside observer's head, looking at these positions and possibility of meanings, interviewing both families, teachers, and herself, and finding differences and really polyphony in play. So that's a very big difference, but at the same time it's very complementary, because her perspectives necessarily come from constantly questioning as an outsider, and my perspective always comes from I know at least what happened to me, so as an insider, but it's really, one can't live without the other. But what we want to stress, it's always a construction of that data. We don't really know. We can never know, as you will see at the end, but we try to construct the player's point of view as possible, as much as possible.
So since we gave this presentation the title of Postupok, it probably is important that we share, for those of you who aren't familiar with that term, it's a term that Bakhtin uses in its plural sense, a deed, an answerable act that is addressed to other, present or non-present, and in its literal translation, to step or make a step. We use the Slavic word postupok as a lens for looking at play, as a way of being with others and doing something with and to others that has a particular ethical significance, and a particular significance for creating intersubjectivity, but also providing room and celebrating alterity. In the Russian use of postupok, it's used often to describe very significant ethical deeds, like, say, saving someone's life or betraying someone. So it could also be viewed as an act of great significance. In our work, we use postupok to indicate the adductivity of an act or deed in play, its ambiguity, its tendency to stand out of the ordinary, mundane, this worldly, this event. And in this sense, we use it, as Bakhtin does here, to describe acts rather than to name or frame play itself, which it seems to us many people have a penchant to do, since we recognise that play exceeds any one definition. In fact, once it's defined, it's captured, as Bakhtin would tell us, and finalised, and then unable to be thought of otherwise, despite what our essentialist legacies might suppose. So, as I've explained, every deed is an answerable act, and you can read this quote of Bakhtin's Every Thought of Mine, along with its content, as an act or deed that I perform, my own individually answerable act or deed. It's spoken into the social world. It is shaped and reshaped by those seen and unseen, who who are significant to its presence. And we can think ourselves of times in our lives when we've invoked the voice of somebody from our past or our pretend future into a play experience, so that we can do that. You're kidding. So we argue that play is a special set of post hoc, a certain kind of addressivity that is unique because it operates on a set of boundaries that make it possible for human beings to step into previously unimaginable roles and spaces whilst maintaining a sense of otherness in accordance with one's personality, orientation and socially oriented multiple agendas. I think I'll skip the next two slides.
Okay.
I just want to show you, can we just show them the dance picture? When viewed as post-hoc, our play thus becomes elusive yet stable, simultaneously enabling people to explore possibility as imagined reality and vice versa, to explore reality as imagined possibility. The living event posits play in time and space, where the event is deeply meaningful to those involved at the time, but is not necessarily performed for others. This is what Bhakti means when he talks of play taking place when the footlights are off, and we love that metaphor. Play is for the players. Spectators are not compulsory, but may be necessarily influenced and influencing the play. Thus, interaction among people, when seen as a mutually addressed post-hoc, is a kind of dialogic dance that involves individual players entering in and out of relationships, participating in and creating events, addressing each other and being addressed by them in different roles from different positions that are embodied for and with I, the other, and I for the other.
Okay. We also use the concept of chronotope, Bakhtinian concept of chronotope, as a systematic unity of time, space, and axiology, a value system. As Bakhtin says, the place where the knots of narrative are tied and untied. Time, as it were, thickens, takes on flesh, becomes artistically visible. So, in the concept of chronotope, we understand it as describing events that are eventful, not some universals, something that happens here and now, even though if it's in a unique space or unique spaces. And one thing that we see happening is that in the moment of play, in the moment of the beginning of play, actually there is not one chronotope, several chronotopes emerge at the same time. And we describe them as the community of players chronotope, reality chronotope, imaginary chronotope, and audience chronotope. What it means is that enables a possibility of for the players and the non-players to see multiple chronotopes at the same time and to relate each other to each other on their boundaries. Chronotope points to a unique time and space, a value of an event rather than having universal meanings. And as an event, it is made out of post-hoc, and it is experienced through living through it. So it's again a Russian word, perezhivание. So this is just one of the ways how we can represent it. They all exist at the same time, and what's important about them, about looking at play through the chronotopes, is that exactly what the Rupert Wegerif was talking, the boundaries are very important because play enables, playing enables to create multiple chronotopes because there are boundaries and because there is negotiation of what is on the boundaries. We only have 1 minute for that, so we will skip several of this quotes. I want to just then give you 1 or 2 examples. Maybe we can have about 4 minutes more than that, so that we can talk about something that's palpable, more palpable. So I want to analyze one one play event, and to look at the boundaries between different chronotypes that there exist. This is from my data from very early on when my older son was very small. He was born in '79, so he was 3 years old. And as you see, I said to him, let's play a father and a daughter, where I would be a daughter and he would be a father. The colors here and the indentation is my analysis. The black is the ongoing everyday reality chronotype. The blue is the imaginary, what we are playing about. I cuddled with him a little bit and he was kissing me. At one moment, I as a daughter started to pick my nose. I started daring with Giga as the father. And then there is this negotiation. In effect, he's not anymore. He's on the boundary. He says, oh, you're my son then. But you don't know whether that statement is from inside the imaginary chronotype or from not, because that's his position. And I am still within, and I say in small voice, no, I'm your daughter, you're a little girl. And then he completely stops and says, no, but girls do not pick their noses. And I say, how do you know they don't? I never saw it. So this is now a serious negotiation from the point of view of us having positions about that. And he says, what do you think? I said, I never saw it, he says. So I said, what do you think? And then he tries to go back, thinking a little bit more, and he's again on the brink saying, well, then I'm getting out of that nose peak sitting, which is a joke, really. Now I say, so what do you mean nose peak sitting? Is that where everybody picks their noses? And he says, yes. And I said, even adults, challenging again, and that completely stops that play and says, no, adults never pick their noses and can't continue. So in that sense, I wanted to illustrate the boundaries between different chronotypes. And I guess we are running out of time, so we can, we have to just finish with one last slide. Okay, and our references.
There's plenty of other examples which will be in that paper.
And if you're interested, we can put them in the paper. We have some movies too for you to see if possible. So here we are. We boldly propose that play is a creative genre of being with others, which first and foremost belongs to the players and not exclusively to the domains of education and or development, whether the footlights or out of examination are off or on. In this dialogic sense, there is always room to be otherwise. The opportunities are open to adults and children alike.
Thank you, Jane. Anna, you have about 6 minutes for questions or discussion.
Yes.
Yeah, Actine is actually pretty hard on play. There's a good 5 pages in Author and Hero in Aesthetic Activity, where he talks about how when children play, they imagine but they do not image. And what he means is they go out to the viewpoint of another, but they don't return to their own point of view. And actually, your data shows that they do pop in and out of chronotype phrases, the different chronotype frames, what you were coloring there. So, my question is, doesn't this suggest that play does have, but isn't what that team talking about, the non-developmental aspect of play, and doesn't this suggest, your own data suggests that actually play does have this developmental aspect and it's not visible from play itself? Because it's different.
Yes. It could suggest that if you want to look at that from that point of view, but in our examples and ways of looking, we are looking at how people make meaning in here and now, and whether that eventually leads to development, we are not studying. It could suggest if you want to look at it, right?
I guess we were quite keen to sort of avoid that, and you've raised probably one of the biggest challenges for us in this work, and is that whilst we're arguing against sort of an essentialist approach, we are also from the essentialist approach, and so we're constantly catching ourselves being caught within that, and we're still exploring the methodological ways to do this, not suggesting for a moment that they're right. If we had more time, we could have shown you the polyphonic footage and the ways Anna's given you her interpretation of that, but we're not saying that's the only interpretation. We're saying that we all come at it via our own ideological orientation. And yes, I agree with you in that early work, Bunting did speak of play in that way.
Yes.
But we're drawing on his work over a lifetime. So we're actually picking up on his ideas as he moved into the idea of discourse, orientation, and of course that long-standing approach to addressivity. So as much as wherever we pause at any one moment, I think this is something I'm really picking up attention in this conference already. Wherever we pause at any moment, and when we use a quote or a presentation or an approach, we're locking ourselves in. And we've talked about that a lot, haven't we, Anna, about how do we do this without actually doing the very thing that we're trying not to do. Doesn't mean that we can't talk about play at all. Is that what it means? Or does it mean that we need to we need to keep it open somehow and celebrate that? And that's what we're arguing for, whilst, I appreciate your critique.
Can I add something also? We are at the brink of trying to create a new kind of, I don't even want to say methodology, because it brings in the natural science point of view of how you study something, because we think that studying play is, in a dialogic way, is always then responding and constructing new meanings that may have not been the meanings of the children or adults who are playing. In that sense, there is a whole challenge to all of us looking at the human consciousness and human meaning making, to how do we study it and not think that we can kind of peek into the consciousness of the other. So there are many different responses. It's almost like Bakhtin's study of literature, and the old one, like, what did the writer want to say?
And that's what, in my PhD, that's what I did, was analyse play as specific genre, which actually positioned play very differently. And one of the things that we were trying to promote here is this idea of alterity as a form of dynamic agency for the very young child, because as soon as the spectator or adult is in the play, and in Anna's case she was the adult in there, as soon as somebody's in there, the play's going to change. The play's already changed. It's slipped beyond what it was 2 minutes ago. And as we're describing that play of Giga, how old is he now? 35. So, we're describing the play as, it would be very interesting, for example, to get Giga's kind of point of view on that experience. And so, it's no mean feat. Yeah, one should not avoid it though, because we think that play, as we're saying, is really, really important for all of us.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you.
Right, our second speaker is Leah de Vocht from the University of Canterbury. And Leah will be exploring dialogic research as a tool for teachers to respond morally to children's utterances.
Good afternoon and welcome to the session. I will give a presentation.
Excuse me, Jane, you have a hot drink.
Oh, sorry. You can be my assistant now. Thank you. I will start with a brief explanation of this presentation. I start why that this forms part of my PhD and why I focus on Bakhtin in my PhD. And the majority of this presentation I will talk about the dialogic process between the teachers and myself, and how that is in a moral response to children's utterances. I started a long time ago with an interest in teacher-child dialogue, and it was mostly from a technicist point. And there is quite an extensive amount of research that looks at the dialogue between teachers and children from that perspective. And what the research mostly talks about is that there has been a shift, and that teachers are asking more open-ended questions and leaving pauses for children to respond, so there is more respect for children's utterances. But teachers still ask questions that the children often, that the teachers know the answer to, and they tend to be non-challenging. There are some studies also that look at teacher-child dialogue from post-structural perspectives, and also look at power inequity between teachers and children. I like some of these studies, for example, Lopman, who talks about teacher-child dialogue as an improvisation theory, where all players work together in an unscripted scene or story. So that was quite helpful, and some of these others, which I won't dwell on because I know time's quite limited, but I'm very happy to speak about it if people would like to individually later on. Some of these talk about the power imbalance between teachers, and some of these people also use Bakhtin to explore teacher-child dialogue, and I'm greatly indebted to Jane for her work in this. So for my PhD, I use Bakhtinian theories to explore the above question, how to explore teacher-child dialogues in early childhood settings, to what already is. And I have a personal pedagogy of children as active participants and as education as dialogic, unfinalized and open-ended. And I am influenced in this by Gert Pista, of course. I will go very quickly over this because we're very familiar in this group, I think, with what Bakhtin's stance is on dialogue, and that life is by its very nature dialogic. I took notice from Bakhtin's point that he doesn't believe in universal ground theories, but that he looks at the uniqueness of each event. That, of course, dialogism is really important, and that education generally tends to be authoritative and monologic. That the outcome is, that there tends to be an emphasis on outcome rather than on process, what Bakhtin sort of prefers. And also what goes right through his work, and especially in his earlier work, moral and ethical responsibility to take action, which I think is very relevant for teachers as well. I particularly like this quote: "To be for myself means to be present to myself as someone yet to be. And to cease being present to myself as someone yet to be, to turn out to be all I can be already here and now, means to die as an intelligent being." I'm informed by Bakhtin's use of classical literature like Dostoevsky and Rabelais, and how he philosophizes using classical literature about human nature. So I started out, so for me what is really important is that what does this theory mean for me? How does that make meaning for me in my own life and in my life's experiences as a teacher educator? And so I started in my PhD with a methodology where in the first phase I was using Bakhtin to think about teacher-child dialogue, so what happened in the early childhood setting between teachers and children. But then in the first phase of my PhD study, I interviewed teachers before I went in and did observations of these dialogues and recorded. And then I had informal interviews with teachers after transcription of data. At that point, I was thinking about analysing in a way through critical discourse analysis, and thinking about how do teachers construct knowledge and what it means to be a teacher and what it means to be a child, which of course is very much at the heart of critical discourse analysis. And I think in that sense I was perhaps a little bit influenced by one of my supervisors, previous supervisors I should say. And in a way I was generalizing teacher-child dialogue. I wasn't looking at the unique experience. And of course, as Paul Sullivan tells us, we can use many different approaches when using a Bakhtinian framework, but we need to look very carefully at what it is that we would like to achieve. So here's a segment. So as I said, I'd like to make visible for you what were my lived experiences looking at teacher-child dialogue, through a Bakhtinian lens. And so this is a segment of the first phase, where the teacher asks the children, what are they going to do for Dad on Father's Day? And so the teacher says, how about Mariah? What does your dad like to do? So she's asked already a number of other children, and she helps them along sometimes when they have difficulty thinking about what they're going to do. But Mariah, after a pause, says, my dad, he doesn't like me watching TV in my bed, and I always put the television on. And so Karen, the teacher, says, so perhaps on Sunday you will leave the television, and she pauses, and the other children say, off. But Mariah, in a firm voice, says, no. And so Karen says, does Daddy like you watching television? No. So Mariah could leave the television, and she pauses again, and she says, off. Mariah, but I am going to turn it on. And here the other children in the group, about 8 children, they giggle, and sort of a nervous giggle. And Karen doesn't give up on this and says, remember whose special day it's going to be? And the other children say, Dad. And Karen, so we're going to do things that'll make Dad feel, and she pauses again, but no children reply at this time. And Mariah, in a firm voice, says, but I'm going to turn the television on. I think, linking to the previous speakers, I think this is a good example of alterity, don't you think so? And so Karen says, poor Dad, let's hope Jamie can find something that makes Dads happy. And Jamie is the 1-year-old in the family. And so what I'm trying to illustrate here is how, of course, Mariah has agency, that she has a genre where she stands up against the monologic teaching, that the teacher is, of course, showing here. And Mariah is very much an active agent, and what I notice here, and of course my whole presentation here is my monologic interpretation of what is happening here. But in my view, the children were quite nervous, a nervous giggle, and then didn't fill in the words anymore for the teachers. And in my view, the children were more or less aligning themselves, knowingly or unknowingly, I'm not sure, with Mariah. Well, certainly they weren't conforming anymore. So Mariah is resisting a social cultural expectation that on Father's Day you must do something nice for Dad. In my view, this is a good example of open-ended dialogue. I'm not saying whether this is right or wrong, but I do think that is definitely different from the monologic teaching that the teacher had in mind. And so this is a good example of Mariah, but what about the teacher? It could be argued that the child felt that they could disagree, and that the vignette shows authoritarian monologue. And so while I was exploring open-ended dialogue between teachers and children, I myself had finalized this teacher. In a sense, I felt I was disrespectful. When I'm using this vignette, I am presenting this teacher in a not so good way, and she has no way to respond to that. I was not really walking the talk that Bakhtin was telling me myself. So a Bakhtinian framework was used then to not only open up my thinking how to analyze the data, but to also guide the research process. And looking at dialogic research, looking at notions of becoming and of being unfinalized for the participants, the children, the teachers, but also for myself. So I then looked around and again was very much indebted by James research in early childhood settings in New Zealand. It was such a coincidence to find out that we're both using this Bakhtinian framework, and then there was this wealth of writing that you're doing, so very much I thank you for that. But also others like Paul Sullivan and I think Eugene Matusov, even when he isn't necessarily talking about research but about dialogic pedagogy. I think that all those people have kind of informed me that there was a different way that I could do this. So dialogic research, whereby participants, including the researcher, are represented as engaged in their own struggles of becoming, as opposed to being participants and as finalised subjects. There are limitations, and I'm really pleased and heartened to have heard some of these already come up, this morning, yesterday. And some of the things that I am still struggling with is, of course, the perceived lack of attention to power issues that Bakhtin, Holquist, for example, talks about that. And also an overly optimistic view of addressing power relationships in the Carnivalesk response. I'm still thinking about that, and if there is time, even after today's presentation or during the conference, through other presentations, but perhaps also through individual dialogues, I would really like to hear other people's views on that. I think that Bakhtin talks about the unique event, but everybody comes to this event with different chronotopes. And I think that Bakhtin doesn't dwell so much on the historical institutional power imbalances, but he certainly, having lived in Russia in that context, he certainly would have been very aware of it. And I think his writing somehow shows